Delivery of innovation and innovation of delivery. What a wonderful line to start this conversation. I'm Archana Shukla from CNBC TV 18, not an expert in infectious diseases or anything to do with medical science, but a journalist. So we'll try to pose a few questions that most of us have right now when we are talking of outbreaks and epidemics like that of coronavirus. Dr. Piot, with your experience, of looking at dealing and managing multiple epidemics in the last few years and also very closely working in the HIV/AIDS space. In the current scenario with the coronavirus outbreak and the way countries have managed it, from China to the other countries, US, India, do you think we are in a better position today versus what we were and the way we were handling these type of epidemics, let's say 5 to 7 years ago?
When we take two moments in time in terms of epidemics, SARS, which hit in 2003, and then Ebola in West Africa 2014, we are definitely better prepared in several ways. Compared to SARS, for example, there's more openness and sharing of information. SARS, China covered up the beginning of SARS for quite a while, and in epidemics, timing is everything. No Time to Lose is the title of my memoir, and that's because if you intervene very early on, you can prevent so many other cases. So openness, sharing of information, that is much better. And secondly, we have technology. I remember when we isolated Ebola virus, this was in 1976, it took a couple of weeks to know that we had a new virus and so on. Today, in a couple of hours, you can just know you have a new virus, you have the sequence and all that. So technology is also now side. On the downside, I would say, is that mobility is much, much bigger and the world is far more connected. So we're at higher risk from that perspective.
Well, listen, then in such sort of a scenario, you also mentioned that most of the epidemics that we are seeing right now are respiratory borne. Add to that the mobility that people have now, traveling countries and continents. The way the outbreak would spread would be fast. How can we deal with that and the containment measures that countries can look forward to right now? In that light, do you think what countries have done now in terms of banning travel for people from China in the light of the coronavirus outbreak, does that help?
Yeah, first of all, I should say that like Ebola makes headlines and people are very concerned, but Ebola is never going to give rise to a worldwide pandemic because you need very, very close contact with someone with the infection. But it's the respiratory ones, as you mentioned, that I'm concerned about. Now, do travel restrictions make sense or not? No, the World Health Organization, when it declared the coronavirus, COVID-19 outbreak as of international concern, explicitly recommends against travel restrictions. And I don't think they can slow down maybe the spread of the virus, but we should say the most important thing for slowing down the spread is a few things. One is that China gets the epidemic under control, and they're really going for very draconian measures that I don't think any other country, perhaps except for North Korea, can implement. But also is to make sure that for travelers who have that contact with a country where there are cases, but there are already 25 cases. The US has cases also. India has cases. UK. So are we going to ban all travel from the US, from the UK? That it's not going to work. And models use that. Also, for example, you have to think also what the implications would be if suddenly all international travel would come to a standstill. I think the economies would collapse as well. But what we need to do is to make sure that we have good screening of all travelers, clear instructions what to do, making sure also that we have full documentation who is in the plane and what and so on. So that can help. But I would use that, at the moment, no travel ban has really stopped an epidemic in history.
There is a growing discrepancy in how people are looking at this. Some are saying that we've already hit a pandemic level, some are saying we're still far from it. Where do you think the coronavirus outbreak is right now? Is it on its way to becoming a pandemic?
Yeah, there are many mathematical models that suggest different things. I would say that the jury is still out, and I think the next couple of weeks will be very important. If you assume an incubation period of between, let's say, 5 days and maybe 2 weeks, with the great migration around the Lunar New Year in China, people are now back, factories start to be reopened and so on, travels going back also, for example, from China to Africa, where there are 1 million Chinese. Will that give rise to new epidemics or not? We will see over the next 2 years. The number of cases has been falling in China, but we don't know really how representative that is. But I think it's predictable that we will see more and more spread in an increasing number of countries. The question is what percentage will be involved. So we have to accept that there's uncertainty, and we cannot take the risk of taking all these measures. I'd rather be accused of overreacting than of not doing my job and then having to face a huge epidemic.
I wanted to touch upon that point of overdoing it from the perspective of the international health agencies, like that of the World Health Organization. Do you think, World Health Organization took some time before it declared it a medical emergency of international concern? Do you think they were late in doing that, considering they've also been criticized in the past during the flu pandemic, during the earlier epidemics, where they were criticized for overdoing it?
Yeah, damn if you do, damn if you don't, in a sense. WHO was accused of overreacting with the bird flu, this H1N1 some years ago, and indeed it did not turn out to be as bad as we thought. In the case of Ebola in 2014, it was months too late. In this case, I think maybe 1 week too late. The problem is also that the international health regulations, this treaty among member states, only foresees one category, or two categories, binary. Either it's a public health emergency of international concern, or it is nothing. It's like you would say, it's a hurricane or it's no hurricane. No, we have 1 to 5 types of, range of hurricanes. And I think that system has to be, to change. But from my perspective, and I'm definitely not a scaremonger type at all, but we cannot take the risk because of the uncertainty. And when you look at the economic disruption that this epidemic is causing, with ripple effects to India, even for the pharmaceutical industry. Yep. API is coming from China for a large extent, and so on. Even the masks, there is a shortage. Most of them are made in China, and so on and so on.
You spoke about the availability of drugs, you spoke about the availability of masks, and which is where I wanted to touch upon the fact, how do you think countries with poor health systems, like those, let's say, in Western African countries, and even India to a large extent, considering the density of population that India has, are at this point in time positioned to handle an epidemic like that of coronavirus?
No, any health system, even let's say from the UK and the National Health Service, if there would be a surge of, let's say, 20% more people who go to emergency rooms, who have to be admitted with pneumonia, the system would not be able to handle it. It's already hard for a normal flu season. So there are lots of exercises that are being held. But I'm certainly concerned for where there is, weaker health systems, where hospital hygiene and infection control is not good. You can imagine that someone who's admitted with such a viral infection could spread very fast to doctors, nurses, but also other patients. And I think that plus in addition that in India, at least every state should have a lab that is capable of diagnosing this infection, so that you don't have to wait for the result and send it to Pune, where there's the National Virology Lab or Institute. So I think it has to be taken seriously, and I know that measures are being taken, but it requires quite a mobilization of everything. And frankly, if it's, let's call it a false alarm now, there will be a time when the country will be swiped by a virus, if only an influenza one. So good to have a fire drill. And you should not start a fire brigade when the house is on fire. You have to prepare in between fires.
Right. But you know, there were reports in India particularly that the first line of prevention, which was screening at the airports, was even very slow. It was in fact at a voluntary level that, you know, if you're coming from an international location, maybe from China, only if you are, you know, feeling like fever, do you go in for screening, otherwise you don't. Do you think that it's time now that countries like India step up in terms of formalizing the screening methodologies in situations like this?
Yeah, screening on the basis of fever is only partly effective because not everybody with this COVID-19 will have fever, yeah. So it's limited. But I agree it should be done in a, you know, in a systematic way. Otherwise, as modeling shows, it's not going to be effective. So, but when I arrived here, you know, from London, we had to fill in the form and so on and give the number. And I think it is a very difficult, how to say, trade-off between making sure you can continue to live and to operate in life and in society, and having all the information.
Want to touch upon, you know, from the space of vaccine development and research for emerging diseases. Do you think the countries are actually only at this point in time making moves that are more reactionary, or do you think countries like India have certain policies in place which would look at developing vaccines or treatments for emerging diseases?
Yeah, I think India has come a really long way and is, I would say, more and more at the forefront when it comes to vaccine development even. Not only vaccine manufacturing, which is already, you know, you're really a prime manufacturer. And as I mentioned in my talk about where I was yesterday at Biological E, but also Serum Institute, Bharat, and so on. But India is also a founding member of CEPI. Has contributed, and there is money available for to be used where there's no market incentive. I would distinguish between vaccines where you can make money with, and there are plenty of them, but the fact that influenza vaccine is not in part of the Indian vaccination program, that is going to hit back at some point. It has to be up. We also have other issues around, like we have a vaccine against cancer. We talked a lot about cancer treatment. We have a vaccine against cancer, HPV, you know, is very effective against cervical cancer. It's not being used, and there are lots of rumors and all that. So dealing with the fake news and the rumors is as important as having the vaccine.
Right, but you know, in situations like these, there are a lot of therapy areas which are being tried and tested in clinical trials. I was reading somewhere that at this point in time globally about 80 clinical trials are going on, testing various methodologies, testing various treatments, including antiretroviral drugs, if they can some way benefit patients suffering with the coronavirus disease. Do you think that's a haphazard way of going ahead, or do you think all methods are good enough in a situation like that?
No, I think, good question. We will only know if we use whether a therapy works, whether it's a drug or monoclonal antibodies also, immunotherapy, if we do very rigorous trial. And there are standardized protocols that are being shared and that are being used in China, but not all trials will give the answer. And the randomized controlled trial was invented at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, so we very much, you know, wed to it, because it's a disease where if it's like what we heard for some cancers at 90% fatality rate or 100%, Ebola, you know, 50, 60%. Okay, if you see that nearly everybody is secured, then you can say it works. But in a disease, an infection like COVID-19, we need randomized controlled trials, and otherwise we don't know. And I think this is where there's a need for really good coordination and very, you know, how to say, very correct and rigorous trial methodology. And I hope that that's going on, but I don't have the information.
But looking at most of the vaccine development or progress on that part, even you said CEPI is pushing forward to some vaccine development for COVID-19. Any idea by when we could see a treatment or a vaccine for something like a coronavirus?
Yeah, if we're lucky, I think within a month or so we could already have an indication which antiviral therapies will work against COVID-19. Because there's so many patients, and if they use the right protocols and the disease spectrum, in a couple of weeks you see the outcome, starting with survival or not, and then severe infection and so on. So that's a matter of a couple of months. For vaccines, that's going to take much longer. I mean, I know there have been announcements made that in a few weeks' time even we will have. That is definitely not something that is going to happen, and I think that we will have a vaccine if it works, because the vaccine, let's not forget HIV, we've been working on a vaccine since 1984,
yeah.
and it's still not an effective vaccine. The last trial that was opened and analyzed and showed that it was not effective. There are others going on. So it's by no means certain that we have a vaccine, because there's no vaccine on the market against coronavirus. So in the best case scenario, I think it'll be like maybe by the end of the year, because that we would have something that is widely available and at millions and millions of doses. But we don't have an animal model. We don't know what the correlates of protection are. The technologies that are being advocated for rapid vaccine development, like RNA vaccine, DNA vaccines, no vaccine of that platform is actually on the market yet. So this is going to be formidable obstacles. But the good news is they start to work on it now, and we will have a vaccine when there's the next epidemic.
What role can the large pharmaceutical players play here?
Well, the holders of innovation are in big pharma and in startups, in biotech, and using this, the best technology to speed up, this innovation here. And as you could see, the CEPI gave, grants to 3 small companies, well, 2 startups and a university, and then a big company, Janssen J&J, has also announced that they will start, and maybe others. So it's a combination that's going to be, achieve results. However, we also need to make sure we have the regulators on our side. And what happened during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa was that indeed, there was fast tracking, but once something is no longer headlines, we go back to normal, and that back to normal can be pretty slow. So that's where the problem, of course, that we all know is that vaccines, safety is everything. And so that is really something, that's why it also takes so long, quality assurance and all that.
Right. Just as a last question before I throw open the thing for question and answer from the audience. Countries, nations, their investments in core infrastructure healthcare and in pushing for development of treatments and vaccines for emerging diseases. Which countries do you think are actually taking a lead, and where do you think India stands on that right now?
Which countries, sorry, are?
Nations investing in core infrastructure healthcare. Do you think there are countries that are actually expanding on that very well, and where does India stand right now?
Yeah, in terms of epidemic preparedness, there is even a systematic review of it, and frankly, no country is fully prepared for a mega epidemic. But I would say, safely speaking, that most of Western European and North American countries, Japan, Singapore, are well prepared. But it is related to the infrastructure in the health system. India depends on the state, but there are really very good labs. There is good public health infrastructure, but it's very unequal. And so there's a long way to do. And I hope that an epidemic like this one is an incentive for investing in this kind of infrastructure. As I said, no country can afford to set up a fire brigade when the house is on fire. You need to invest in between, and you need regular fire drills.
Yeah, but the fact that none of the countries outside of China have declared it a local outbreak, does that reflect on their preparedness, or does that reflect more from the virus itself, on how it can spread?
Well, it reflects in the first place on people. People are moving and going from here to there. And then, then you've got countries that are better prepared, have systems, but like Singapore, for example, but it's small, it's 7 million people, it's less than Hyderabad. But it is every country needs that system. On the one hand, that's the paradox. It's a global issue. No country can solve it alone, but on the other hand, the epidemic the viruses will exploit where the control measures are the weakest and where, it will always look for opportunities to infect more people. Because their raison d'etre, their reason of living, what's an existential question now? A virus, what's the purpose in life? Is find a host and find as many hosts as possible to survive. That's it. So that's what we are up against.
Singapore may be smallest, but they've in fact reported secondary infections in
yes,
also in
but they know where they are. Other countries may not fully know what's going on.